Welcome to Software Snack Bites. I'm your host, Shomik of Bold Start Ventures, where we partner with dev first and SaaS founders from the first line of code. Today, we're excited to have Dave Dorman on the show. Dave is VP Self-Serve at Grafana and previously was Director of Growth at DigitalOcean. In this episode, we're going to cover all things developer marketing, practical PLG tips, and how to scale open source products. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, man.
I want to start off actually with kind of the DigitalOcean journey, because I think one of the things about DigitalOcean is that when I even just go out and search for basic topics, right, I'll come across a tutorial, I'll come across a piece of content or something like that. It could be on something super random, like a certain specific type of Kubernetes cluster or something like that. And still there'll be some sort of DigitalOcean content that's out there. And so it seems like that was a very strategic focus. So how did that kind of form? How'd you go about doing that? Was it an org-wide decision? Like, just talk about that.
Yeah. So the technical content story at DigitalOcean was the engine that drove the business forward, right, at the end of the day. I think a lot of people look at DigitalOcean, especially as it went public. I would talk to folks who were looking at the business and they were like, how does this company even compete with like Amazon, GTM? Like, how is this even a thing? But I think a lot of it started with DigitalOcean said, hey, we're actually marketing to developers, right? Like, we don't care where they're going, nights and weekends, at work, whatever it might be. Turns out there's tens of millions of developers around the world, and we can really go after that market. And with the founders, well before I even joined there, we're like, hey, we're going to write tutorials, documentation for all these other open source projects out there. Like, people in 2013, 2014, like, no one was taking that seriously. Like, some of the most popular open source projects in the world would defer people over to DigitalOcean tutorials at the time. And I think what was really different about it was not blogs. I think everyone would create content that was in blogs. DO said hey, we're going to write things and we're going to maintain it. That was a tremendous effort that our community and developer relations teams went after. That isn't quite everyone else, right? A blog is very ephemeral. You write it, you never update it, you call it a day. DigitalOcean really treated these things as documentation, which was sort of unlike how everybody else was doing it. So I'll pause there, but there's a lot more to sort of get into about how did the team think about what things to focus on.
So I think the question that would be most relevant for some of the founders and early employees listening is kind of how do you codify that into a strategy? I mean, was there some sort of specific sort of thing of hey, we ship this product or we finish this sprint and then we're going to publish a post about it or something? Was there anything codified like that?
Yeah, there's definitely an evolution. I think the early days, and they just nailed it, right? I think the obvious thing I've learned sort of sitting on more on the marketing and product side is let technical folks who know the product and space very well figure it out. That was the early days on the technical writing side of the folks who were writing these things just understood Linux inside and out, right? And would figure out what are the right things to work on. And I think they were able to kind of go after the big pillars over time, right? And I think one of the important things, before I sort of get very specifically into your question, was what Dio, I think, really nailed early on this specific topic was we don't have to write about ourselves. It's not about running WordPress or a LAMP stack on DigitalOcean. It's you're running it somewhere. Right? So if we wrote how to install LAMP on Ubuntu X, Y, or Z, it didn't matter. You were probably not actually running it on DigitalOcean. You were probably running it locally. You were probably running it on EC2 or Linode, wherever you were going to run it. And that didn't matter. That was a seed in people's minds. So, well, Dio helped me out this time. This was the best tutorial I've ever got after. Well, maybe the next time or the following time when I'm trying to spin something up, I'll probably consider Dio. Turns out it's also everyone else I know uses this thing. They had great tutorials. It's probably the cheapest thing in the market. Right, all those things combined, let's say not the win today, but the win later, right? That took, I think probably the founders understood that, just to be very clear, right? Turns out these guys are really smart. But over time, as we thought about the strategy around the tutorials we're going to work on, how we think about getting people to eventually convert, right? Was hey, this actually wasn't a day zero conversion type of tactic. This was actually playing the long game. So that was one, not quite the question, but one important thing to consider about how we thought about that. To maybe specifically address how do you build a strategy around it? Well, one, I think it started with, we went really broad, right? The biggest topics in the world, technology-wise, is where Dio did really well very early on. Going after WordPress developers, LAMP, pick the most important, the biggest part of the market, and we wrote about those things and did very well. But as the product matured, right? So I joined the company in 2015, sort of maybe a little after the Series A. As we were starting to release all these additional products after DigitalOcean Droplets, just, virtual machines, really figuring out how do we really go wide. We could use something like Kubernetes. I think we released that in 2017, 2018, I don't know at this point. There was a fairly specific strategy about how we're going to go about this, right? How do we think about more top of funnel things in this regard of what is Kubernetes? Why do you use it? How does it compare to other alternatives to Kubernetes at the time, which I don't know if even exists nowadays. These comparison type articles were great at bringing people in who are already exploring these things, then getting all the way down into something very tactical in terms of how are you going to optimize some node on some pod, as an example. And that we were fairly deliberate about that as the company matured. Let's be clear, like in the early days, a lot of times it's let's pick the biggest part of the market or the biggest topic to get some eyeballs on. But then we were able to really start digging into like, well, there's these conceptual things. And then there's I'm finger on a keyboard already in my terminal. And how do I solve a problem, right? And I think that was one way we always thought about the world was super high. And then like, I'm finger to keyboard solving a problem today.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious because a lot of times founders are hiring product marketers. And certainly one component to it is this content calendar and technical content approach and trying to codify that. But I guess like, what does it mean, right? Like when you joined, right? What did that mean? What were you kind of tasked with? What did you scope out as like, this is going to be my role so that like, kind of founders listening can understand what that context is?
I saw it over 5 years there and some of the evolution of like, what was the role of product marketing maybe when I first joined and where it landed. And even when I'm here at Grafana, it's a little different. So that's one just general learning over time was like product marketing is very different at every stage, at multiple stages and different go-to-markets, right? Like DO is the ultimate PLG, very little human interaction. It was like a customer success type of sell as opposed to like, traditional enterprise sales, which is very different than the role of product marketing here. So maybe just to sort of set those things apart, which lots of other people can probably speak even more intelligently to. So that was number one. When I first joined, I think the unique thing for DigitalOcean was it was just a platform, right? It's the most horizontal play in the world of like, we got virtual machines, do whatever you want, which is how you get to 1 million paying customers and hundreds of thousands of people signing up every month for the type of product. So it was very much like a consumer-y go-to-market, almost unintentionally. Like it didn't matter, right? I don't think the company in the early days had to be that intentional about it, but it was, hey, they're software developers and everyone needs a virtual machine, whether it's like hosting, the Stack Bytes podcast server, right? As an example, like that would be a common use case in the early days. Or it was, actually running your seed stage startup on it. It didn't really matter. I think the point I enjoyed in the business was starting to think about, we have more than virtual machines we're trying to go to market about. We're going to go out implementing more of the cloud primitives, like block storage, context storage, load balancing, like some of the things that nowadays are like pretty standard, like DigitalOcean was really trying to build at that point, was figuring out how do we launch these things and talk to the existing base of users, people already looking at us, to use us for more than like hosting of their WordPress site or whatever it might be. And that was kind of the lens we took it at that point to say, our go-to-market's really going after devs. We don't care about the context. So how do we actually frame the context around using us for some sort of use case at work at the end of the day? So that was really where I sort of started on the product marketing side. And that was really, maybe just to dig in a little more there, was like identifying the use cases. I know that sounds stupid, right? Naive was, hey, what are the actual use cases for, like, why are people today, thousands of people already adopting us for their startup or for their team inside of some reasonably sized company? What are they doing here, right? Like, why are they doing it here versus Amazon? And it was really just like identifying that. And for what it's worth, it's just like good old fashioned hard work, which is talking to customers, right? Like it's not rocket science. I'll tell you, surveying users is a waste of, like, wasn't that useful. If you want to really quantify this, like, sure, you can sign up a survey and get answers back. But I've often found from like the product marketing lens, like that's the most surface level thing imaginable. It's like, you just got to go out there and talk to dozens, at least, customers. And just like, it's one thing to say, hey, we're using you for like video transcoding. That's very easy to put on a website, but like, well, what does that really mean? Why are you using DigitalOcean for this versus the 10 alternatives you possibly could be doing it for, right?
Yeah. I'm curious, 5 years later, when you were kind of getting ready to transition out and stuff like that, like at that time, how would that change? Because you just talked about, hey, we were trying to set up the primitives, things like that. We were trying to educate people on the use case that you could do with them. Well, all that effort worked. And then 5 years later, like people know it, right? So did it start to flip more towards almost comparisons, like, hey, us versus AWS or something? Or I don't want to put words in your mouth, so maybe just talk about how it evolved.
Yeah, there was definitely some of that for sure. I think because there was this multi-thousand-pound gorilla in the room that were the cloud providers, that was always a point of comparison. It's like, well, why would someone choose DigitalOcean? I think that was one of the major parts of the evolution over time was maybe in the early days, it was like, how do we sort of compare to some of the low-end hosting providers, right? Like the Linodes or Vulturs or some of the companies in the world. And probably by the time I was leaving, it was much more around how are we getting the next YC or Boltstar company to use DigitalOcean, and really thinking about like, what is the content that we're going to try and put in front of customers there? Like, how do we think about like the email lifecycle when someone seemingly high value signs up? And I think that was kind of what was unique about product marketing there was it was about releasing these products and focusing on things like, was a big driver for DigitalOcean were all the as a service things that sat on top of the core infrastructure, right? Which was Kubernetes, databases, and so on and so forth, eventually building out a PaaS product where those things, for the most part, yeah, you're going to have people use those as hobby things, but the joke was like, hey, no one's running WordPress on Kubernetes. So those things just naturally gravitated toward like defining a little bit more of the go-to-market and how we spend time on product marketing. So there was like just sort of an evolution of the function there as it relates to how mature the product was. And I think that's the way I would frame it.
Now kind of moving into the Grafana stage and broadly, I would say self-serve in general. So one question I'd like to ask actually is you sort of had, now with Grafana, you have open source and DigitalOcean was not that, was proprietary. And so how does self-serve differ between those two orgs? Or maybe there's similarities. I'm sure there are, but like, kind of, is there major differences that you would point to as well?
It's funny, when I went to go join Grafana, like I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. I was like, I don't know what like this role job is of like, what is self-serve? Like, isn't that just like building a product that people know how to use and they can put in a credit card? Like, that was what DigitalOcean did, right? That was the whole business. So it was like kind of confusing when I was first starting with the Grafana team of like, well, how is this different than marketing? And how is this different than product? Like, where does it actually fit? So they're very similar in many ways, which is at the end of the day, PLG, self-serve, figure out what other word we want to use to describe this stuff was like, how do we help people without necessarily having to talk to someone, see value, and hopefully all on their own, and probably be able to scale to tens of thousands of dollars a month without having to engage with someone, right? So I think at the end of the day, like that narrative is sort of the same between maybe DigitalOcean and Grafana. I think what was different about Grafana was it was very stage dependent. Grafana is one of the most popular open source projects in the world, and Grafana's been around. We just got to Grafana 10. Grafana's been grinding for years, starting in 2014, and really started to see a lot more traction as we got closer to 2018, 2019, 2020, and I joined the business around 2020. There was so much demand for the product at that point, right? I think it's like an important part. So when I say we talk about self-serve at Grafana, Grafana was fairly pervasive in terms of being the front end for observability data, even by that point. And DigitalOcean also had a similar type of inbound motion of that. There was just so much demand and awareness in the market, right? So I found from the self-serve side, both there and here, the similarities were, hey, there's just like a lot of people who already know who we are. Doesn't mean they've used us, right? I think that's like the major fallacy I've seen both places. Sort of learned it the hard way, to be clear. We can talk about that for sure. Is that like, hey, just because people are already coming your way and signing for a product doesn't mean they, especially in Grafana's world, where we have an open source product, doesn't mean they've really ever used it. They might have seen the Grafana dashboard, just to be very clear. And they probably have interacted with it, changed the time frame on some panel. Well, do they want to come here and like set up a data source from scratch and build a dashboard? These are actually very, very different things. And it's the same thing with DigitalOcean. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I think there's a lot of similarities in that both these businesses had lots of traction and inbound awareness already. But then figuring out how you actually drive them to do a thing, right? See value in the product, maybe eventually pay for it, eventually adopt those products. That's a very different game versus maybe demand generation in the first place, or trying to figure out how you're going to, just like people to be interested in your product. So I think those are the similarities I saw here.
So let's actually talk about a little bit more about self-serve and what it actually means, because I think you touched on some interesting points there, which are like, hey, people actually are aware of Grafana, but maybe haven't used the product. I guess like from a responsibility of self-serve, right? Are you trying to increase the awareness of people who are purely at the top of funnel? Are you trying to help with the activation of the people who, again, they've seen the dashboard and now they're coming to check out, like, hey, what's the deal? What can I do here? Like, is it all of the above, right? Like, obviously product marketing is also a function of what you're doing right now. So like, talk a little bit about that. What does this nebulous term mean?
Yeah, it's super context dependent. And I know we'll kind of get into some of this about other companies and how they think about it. What's unique about Grafana, and I'll get right into it, is because of the popularity of Grafana over time, Grafana has built out a good, like a lot of other open source companies, we've monetized well in the early days around enterprises. So we've already been starting to build out by the time we had started to kind of go down this path of focusing on self-service, of already seeing some traction there. There was a trade-off that is real between trying to sell into the largest banks and largest companies in the world and building every last mile feature that's required for them versus hey, there's just like a human sitting at their laptop trying to do something to like connect the data source or try to figure out how to configure OTel to get data into our back end. And that's like a pretty nascent tool and they don't necessarily know how to do it. They're trying to work on with product or engineering or marketing to prioritize those things is a challenge. I think that's actually why the founders at Grafana were very deliberate in the early days when we had first joined to say, hey, we're going to like make this as a team in and of itself and not try and spread the resources too thin. Like, let's focus directly on this and provide the resources we need versus having it get it caught up in the prioritization exercise of all the things we're going to do around focusing on enterprises and the big asset come there. So I think it's maybe just important to frame out a little bit how that sort of came to be. So I think it's mostly here because of some of the inbound demand that is already created by the awareness in the market and adoption of Grafana and open source is really helping on the bring people into our SaaS product, right? So like, if you look at like Mongo or Elastic, right, sort of the prior wave of some of these open source companies, those companies it took them some time to eventually build out a cloud product, and they were obviously been massively successful, which we don't need to get into. For us, that was also true. Like Grafana was built at a time where that wasn't immediate. Figuring out how to run Grafana in the cloud wasn't the first thing that the business was focused on. So probably around 2019, 2020, we really focused on building out a proper hosted product, right? And intentionally, I know we want to get into this, is not just having it be a couple of open source projects hosted in the cloud, right? Like there's a difference between building like a SaaS product and hosted open source. And I think that is what we on the self-serve product-led growth, whatever terms you want to use it, spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we make this faster, better, easier, more integrated than just as a SaaS product versus just running it yourself. So we spend on self-service a tremendous amount of time thinking about all the growth things, right? Let's use growth as another way to describe what the team does. Sign up, onboarding, activation, how are we going to get you to swipe a credit card if that makes sense, which is not for everybody in our product because it's a ton of hobbyists, SREs, and people looking to use us on nights and weekends, which is perfectly acceptable. Toward then figuring out how are we going to take all these people using our product and get it over to sale. So we're really thinking about that entire spectrum, but it's less so thinking about the uber top of the funnel, right? We don't spend that much time, at least at this point in the evolution.
How should early stage teams think about this though? Because they don't codify teams in quite the same way of like saying, hey, we have open source, we have self-serve, we have a sales team, like all this sort of stuff. It's much more broader. But when early stage teams start out, right, obviously, if they are doing open source, they sort of just have an open source team because that's what they're working on, right? And then eventually, they ship this cloud product and they start to think about, okay, well, how do we start to connect between those two and drive that? And how do you think about structuring that? How do you think about the handoff between those, right? What sort of advice do you have around managing those two distinct and separate things, but also they seem to also converge kind of closely as well?
What I'd say has gone well here, and it's sort of different flavors of what it meant to do DevRel. I'm just saying that as a very broad way. DigitalOcean called it our community. Grafana, there weren't many people here with DevRel titles for a very long time even, right? It was all driven through the devs internally building these projects and writing about it on the Grafana blog like clockwork. So different flavors of the same idea of just like doing things, writing about it, driving attention. And I think it's just like the focus is going to be, some cliche is wrapped in all of this, right? But just like using these two companies as examples is helpful to articulate it, was like the focus on those things of like early and often at both companies, it was about like driving awareness and interest in the product by showing value and writing about the product in Grafana terms. Could have been about our logging tool. It could have been about Grafana. It could have been writing about InfluxDB, which is, one of the most popular data sources, whatever it might be, where DigitalOcean was writing these tutorials. So it was like this extreme focus and nailing one of these things. That was the most important bit. I think then like the sequencing in both companies, especially at Grafana, of like, well, it probably would have been hard to build a compelling SaaS product at the same time while we were driving all this adoption of Grafana across the market. So I think there was like this sequencing part that mattered. If we were to do it all over again, it'd be hard to explain, right? Because I think there were, like the timing matters, right? Like Grafana really rode the wave and late of everything going cloud native wave of Kubernetes, Prometheus, Grafana became a stack at the end of the day for doing observability. And that sort of led the company down a path of building Mimir, which is like our Prometheus long-term, our Prometheus backend, Loki, which is sort of uses a similar language as Prometheus, Temple, like basically a very opinionated stack around folks who were trying to monitor many of their cloud native things. Those things wouldn't have happened at Grafana in 2014 because some of the wave didn't yet exist. So I was sort of a non-answer to the question, but it was like very context dependent in both the companies.
I think that makes sense. Timing matters for how things build out, right? And I think the craziest example of this is, in China, there's so much things that are mobile first that we would have just never thought about in the US, but that's all just based on timing. And so to build a business now in China, you certainly would not want to do what we do in the US because like it's just a different paradigm that exists over there. So I think that makes sense here. What's like the hand raise moment though for you and your team of you now know this is a self-serve lead or potential self-serve customer or something? Like, is there something like that you can point to be like, boom, we got them, now we can nurture them, we can do sort of stuff around that?
I chat with like a ton of these like PLG company, like other folks, either like vendors in the space or other companies. The common thread across all these are, and this is what I always find to be difficult, is people raise their hand. Like people like actually raise physically their hand, right? Fill out a contact request form, respond to the email. People are pretty good about identifying like when they actually need to engage in some type of conversation, whether it's with sales or needing the appropriate technical support. One of the things we spent a lot of time on here is somewhere between support and something that's like more than support, but like not quite needing a full SE engagement is where we spend a lot of time on the self-serve world. Hey, just because it's self-serve doesn't mean no humans are in the loop. We're a very complex product at the end of the day, and people need more than just break fix type of support. So we spend a lot of time in proactively reaching out to with a technical team to help our customers get onboarded. I think their early days, it did not look the same, but sort of referred to as like the superhuman for Grafana, which was like, hey, before everyone signs up, we want to make sure we can like walk them through the happy path, even if the product didn't quite get you there. I'll tell you what's fascinating. No, half the time people don't want to talk to you, right? Especially in developer land.
Yeah.
Even if we're legitimately here to help, and that's okay, right? I think it's just like acknowledge it. So where I was going with that is, I think in a lot of these inbound like developer first companies in particular, no one wants to talk to you, and that's okay, right? Like design the experience around that until they want to, right? And like it turns out, just make it very easy to allow them to do that is number one. I think what DigitalOcean did well, Grafana does very well, allowing them to do that. And then those that like, hey, we think are super interesting, and this is lead scoring, whatever else we want to call it, right? But ultimately identifying, hey, there's someone demographically that's interesting for us as a business because they could probably spend a lot, and they're doing something, or some of their product behavior tells us X. Yeah, we want to get a hold of them. I could talk about that all day, just to be clear. But I think the harder part that people don't talk about is, half the time those people don't want to talk to you, right? And like what we don't want to do is, sick SDRs across all these people to hound them across every last channel. That is not also what we want to do. So there's like some balance in between there. And we spend a lot of time talking about that. It's like, hey, how do we actually find the ways nudge to customers both in the product or over email to like, just because we desperately want to talk to someone because we think there's maybe an opportunity, I don't know, 1 of every 5 maybe is willing to engage with us. Like, let's just be realistic. How much can we really move the needle on that metric? So not quite the answer, but that's one of the things both at DO and here, I've sort of just unfortunately observed is we can want to talk to everyone all day long. And if they don't want to engage with us, that is the trade-off we make in self-serve. We open the doors and 80% of the time, no one's going to want to talk to us, even if they seemingly are perfect for us.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about actually is consumer has had this growth function for a while, right? And they have in-app notifications and push notifications and, all this sort of stuff. And we all say we hate it, but at the same time, like, guess what? It gets us to interact with the product quite well and it's quite effective. You just mentioned, for example, like in the app, trying to kind of help people understand, hey, this is also what you could use us for. Here's something that you could do or whatever, right? Are you borrowing stuff from kind of consumer land to think about that, to get users to use the product in different ways?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things, we were discussing is around how is like PLG or self different for like developers versus maybe other functions, right? As an example, I'm like, I think the major difference of like, I don't know, me personally and tools I'm using, like I'm not using them on nights and weekends. There's like not many marketing tools or growth tools that I'm like using around my house, right? As an example, right? But in SRE, develop like technical line, like these are consumer use cases at the end of the day, right? Like the amount of people that are using Grafana in a home lab to like monitor their Tesla Powerwall or Nest thermostat, or even just scratching an itch, right? One way or the other. I mean, it's consumer scale. DigitalOcean was like the epitome of that. And I think Grafana kind of rhymes with it as well. So I think that's one major difference is that like, it's like actually consumery, not even like a little bit, like it's literally a consumery tool. And there's like a funnel into actually some subset are going to be using us at work. There's a lot we could talk about in there. That's the whole thesis in DigitalOcean, in my opinion. So as a result of that, I think because we are marketing to humans and not just like trying to, in the product, sell to some decision maker or someone else, maybe the medpic process as an example, we're like selling to the end user with their finger on the keyboard. We are borrowing, I think, a lot of those growth like tactics, right? Ruthlessly focusing on onboarding. We have a whole team that isn't moving off onboarding, right? For multiple quarters in a row, figuring out like, how do we make this better? How do we make this better? How do we make this better? By whatever metric we want to measure. And thinking about whether it be in product nudges or email, whatever microphone we want to use, to help drive additional product adoption or just genuinely make the customer successful. We have a set of folks who spend their days thinking about that day in and day out. Because at the end of the day, if someone is here for a proof of concept at work, right, they come in hot, they're coming to do that, cool, how do we help them? But I don't think that's any different than helping your favorite neighborhood SRE on trying to do something at home that like whenever they're ready to do something for real the next time, they're going to look at it. Like if they had a shitty experience, I don't know why they're going to come here versus whatever alternatives they might want to go. It's just a different time scale that we're playing that game on.
Yeah, it makes sense. I want to talk actually about how do you structure the self-serve team, if you can go into that, which I think, again, this is something a lot of founders are excited about because they see Grafana doing it and they're like, okay, we want to mimic Grafana's success. And again, maybe in this case, they have the open source adoption, right? They have some enterprise buyers, but they're trying to figure out how do we capture that middle to longer tail of users and do that effectively. And so how did you start the team? How did it develop? Maybe any insights you can share there for other teams.
We break down into like 3 or 4 subsets here. And again, it's like context dependent, right? Because we already have, by the time we joined, Grafana had a small but growing marketing team. We had an enterprise sales organization. So it's like this structure made sense for like our time and place. I would say, as I talk to other early stage companies that are having these types of conversations, like I think a lot of the ways we've structured this team is ultimately a version of what these folks from like a, if they're starting from day zero, very PLG centric, right? Where it's like marketing is thinking about full funnel, not just demand generation, as an example. There's a lot of these similarities that still exist between the structure here and others, right? We kind of look at it 3 ways. And by the way, it sounds good when I'm framing it now with a proper story, but like we've sort of evolved our way into this. We kind of look at it as 3 things. It's our growth team, our like product analytics groups happens to sit within this org. And then for lack of a better term, we have like our human in the loop part of it, right? Self-serve doesn't mean no people, right? Doesn't mean no sales, doesn't mean no technical folks. So we really break it down those 3 ways. On the growth side, growth is becoming like institutionalized. There's people who do growth for a living, it seems, for a while now, right? So we have PMs, some engineers just focused across this. Those all actually sit within this group. But one area that we invested pretty early on was hiring a developer experience function. And what that really meant it was existing folks in the community that just like loved Grafana, right? They were using Loki, they were using Temp, they were using all these tools, and they were writing about it on the internet and wherever they were writing about it and bringing them on into Grafana, right? And it was bringing on like the subject matter experts who were using these tools for work or at home and bringing them inside Grafana to help improve the product, whether that would be docs, whether that would be actually contributing to some of the core things we were building, towards just writing content, whatever it might be. So to me, that's been like one of the home run functions we built within this team. Is it make sense to live in self-serve? I don't know. It just happens to work for us. But to me, it's like a subset of DevRel, and it like kind of made sense to live here in a marketing and product-like function. So that was our growth side.
That was perfect. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what are the other functions.
Cool. And then we have product analytics. Grafana is a visualization tool, right? One of the most popular. So we've beaten the hell out of Grafana as a front end for business intelligence and product analytic data, right? Which is cool. It's actually one of the more rewarding experiences of being able to, as a non-engineer, really be able to use your own product in a day in, day out. We can connect it to Snowflake and BigQuery, on some of the databases. Or if you work at Grafana, you're like forced into learning PromQL and figuring out how to use Loki and using some of our logging tools, eat our own dog food. So it's actually been a very rewarding experience about how we're able to use Grafana as the front end across all the go-to-market teams. So anyway, so that product analytic team sort of drives a lot of that. And then on the other side, we have our human in the loop side of it, where we are focusing on how do we help customers. That's a little bit more on a one-to-one basis, right? Everything else is very one-to-many, right? Is sort of how I would frame all those things. This is going to be the combination of kind of like a cloud sales team where we have folks who are not quite commercial reps and not SDRs, but they are completely trained on our products in the cloud. Like we have multiple product offerings for what it's worth, right? Open source, on-prem licenses, and our cloud products. We have a set of folks just focused on helping customers get onboarded there. And we have what we call our customer success engineering function, which is that like hand-holding technical onboarding experience. We want to make sure if you're coming in here to monitor your Kubernetes cluster and our walkthrough experiences and going to maybe solve all your problems, we have a team that's going to sit here and help you and walk you together. So the combination of this cloud sales / technical onboarding team has been one of the more positive things we've focused on over time.
The interplay between those two. So how does the cloud sales team know that, hey, this is where we pick off versus the technical account team being like, oh, okay, we should dive in here, right? Because I can imagine like that can kind of be nebulous.
I'd be lying if I knew the exact answer, right? The right balance there. And I think we've gone back and forth against it for sure. What we've seen, and I think this applies like in a company that's growing fairly quickly in Grafana versus, just being super early, works. And I think it's why it works for a lot of early founders and people want to have the team, like we have everyone sitting next to each other, right? We have the people talking to the customers, sitting next to the people who are writing the SQL, knowing what questions to ask, sitting next to the product managers and engineers who are building things. Like having that as a relatively small group of people sitting together solves some of these questions of scale. It's imperfect, but I think where we solve this is we find the right way to try and incentivize these people, where we want to make sure our customer success engineers feel part of the discussion on getting a hold of big customers and seeing them grow, which is a similar type of incentive we have for these cloud sales folks. So it's imperfect. We can talk a lot about actually how do we define it for sure, but it's an evolution.
You mentioned, multi-products, right? Multi offerings in terms of delivery, but then also multiple products, right, that people can use as well. I'm actually curious more on the multi-product side. So when a new product gets released, do you start to focus on that a bit more from the self-serve side of kind of saying, hey, now we need to do a lot of education and get people to understand this is something that we just released and they could use? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we have a great marketing team that we partner with and think about a lot of that stuff. That's where our product marketing group lives today. So a lot of that kind of discussion at this point in our journey sort of runs through that group. But I'd say, generally how I think about it, whether it be here or DigitalOcean or other times, it sort of like depends on the maturity of these things. I think what's interesting in open source is we're very quick to release things, right? And get it onto the wild and let it, get in people's hands. So I think there's this balance and to strike where I've seen at Grafana where everything's open source and getting released in very early versions versus I think DigitalOcean was more about shipping a complete experience right out of the gate and just like simplicity and elegance. Like I think that was very much the value proposition of the product. So actually very different businesses in that regard about how we thought about releasing things. And where we might have held things back until we were really ready for this to feel like we could see massive adoption of this thing right away. Whereas I think here, we're less concerned about that, right? We're an open source company. We build things in public and we want to get that feedback loop early and often. And I think in a good way, what we find, where I think that there's power users of all people very interested in our opinion of the world or of how we want to build this, what is the Grafana stack at the end of the day. So it's fairly dependent. I'd say for here, it's a little bit more like release early and often. And maybe we're not being as aggressive about how we want to try and drive adoption, depending on where its maturity is, versus DO, where we're like, did we think we were Apple? I don't know if maybe that type of extreme. But I think if you were to put them on the spectrum, I'd say it looked a little closer to that.
You talk to a lot of teams. They ask you for advice or you share things back and forth. Where does it go wrong? Maybe what's the common thread where you're just like, oh man, I'm seeing it all over again. And this is going to go down that path. And I could just see it. Like, do you have things like that you kind of keep recalling?
Actually, as a general statement, and maybe other people have seen more success on it than I have, is like, I think releasing new products and features just like takes more time in the self-serve world to see adoption than people ever imagine. Whatever you think it's going to be like at a quarter or more. I think it's like a kind of actually a simple answer in my mind. It's like, yeah, just because we release something doesn't mean our customers are ready to use it, right? It's like the same thing about selling your first product. There needs to be time. You need to think about all the reasons why someone's willing to adopt. It's kind of the same thing on the next product or feature you want them to use. And it's just like not their priority, right? Unless it's a burning feature for them and they couldn't get anywhere else. And you will get those. That's why the people adopted day 1 or day 3 or day 30. The reality is this like actually takes more time for people to kick the tires on. If they're migrating from somewhere else, like let's be clear, a lot of things people are releasing, there's an alternative. It might just be a crappy alternative that they've had to figure out on their own, right? Doesn't mean another vendor. But so it takes time. And I think that's always lost. I thought I'd learned that lesson. And then I just continue to make the same mistake on a forecast or some spreadsheet math I put down on, So I think that's like the number one thing is like expectation setting on some of those. On the flip side, you don't want to be like sandbagging this thing. We're never seeing options for the year. So there's a balance, right? Like anything else. But that one always gets me. I don't know. It's just how you were laughing. I said it's the most obvious thing in the world that of course we release some feature, like no one's necessarily going to start using it tomorrow. That's one thing. The other side, I'm not saying anything novel here because other folks, are out in the market talking about it as well. But it's just around that motion from someone starting in self-serve, don't even call it, like someone just signing up on your website. Let's just be very clear, right? And when to introduce salespeople into the equation. And that is, if you go back to some of the things we were discussing before, number one, people don't want to talk. Even if you were giving them one of the engineers sitting on the project, you're going to, 80% of people are not going to respond to you no matter what you want to do. Just take it to that extreme. Everyone nowadays has like one of the founder, CEO, the first email comes from them, they get a reply. And those are always great. For what it's worth, when I first joined, that was the first thing I did to have like all the self-serve emails to like have them come to me. Like it just starts discussions with people. Even there, your reply rates are terribly, terribly low when it's all said and done. So I think it's the problems I've seen just time and time again are like just trying to be super eager and having your sales team reach out and hound these people. And there's a lot we can get into there.
Well, so I think that ties into developer marketing, right? Which is like, it's a very different audience to market towards because of this fact that they want to be fairly low touch. They want to discover things on their own. And this is where I also want to talk about how self-serve and kind of this dev first marketing tie together. But One of the things is obviously we talked a lot about technical content. We talked a lot about the in-app stuff, open source, things like that. But what we didn't kind of cover is DevRel going out there and being on Twitter or talking about how they use Grafana in these different use cases, conference talks and speakers talking about how they've rolled out things, right? Stuff like that, meetups, right? All of that. How does that tie into what's happening on self-serve? Is it very different because of the fact that, hey, self-serve is trying to go from, again, those signups and activations into the product, or do you kind of interface with those teams a bit more?
There's definitely a lot of interface for sure, right? Like, so as I mentioned, we have like a subset of DevRel sits in this group that is developer experience, and they're definitely not very top of funnel, right? It's people who are here looking at the product, trying to do things, right? Like they're the group that built like the Ansible collection for Grafana and the Grafana stack, right? As an example. Like, yeah, there's some top of funnel aspect of that, but that was really to help people who were like, yo, I use Ansible. How am I going to use your tools with it? Like the tool things I'm already using. So there's a ton of interface between those two things, no doubt. I think where you were getting at before is like in the earlier on, right? Because Grafana is like further along on these things. It kind of depends, right? Because I think self-service often as like a function, right, or like a leading PLG, whatever it might be, is very much focused around the aha moment, which I think there is a very much an argument to be made of like how that interfaces with DevRel, no doubt, right? I think that's very important between those two things. But then it really gets into more of the monetization side, product adoption, monetization. I think that's, if I were to like broadly generalize, I'd say most folks when they're talking about self-serve or PLG, or you're looking for your marketing team to sort of lead those things, which is I think what you usually see at earlier stage companies that are PLG focused, is that's the part where I think marketing takes over. Is like once you're in the funnel and then you really get going, where I think generally you're seeing more folks on the DevRel side feeding the top of that funnel, right? And like, I don't know, why does that make sense at the end of the day? At the end of the day, if you're not a developer or an SRE, how are you going to be able to write the words down on the piece of paper to convince anyone that you actually know what you're talking about? This is becoming an institutionalized function over the last 10 years I've been in the space. Is like, it turns out the best way to connect with people, like generally connect, drive awareness, is going to be meeting your users where they are. It's going to be things starting technical bits. You're not going to bring a marketing manager or focus on events out to go talk at a meetup. Like I know that sounds super obvious at this point in 2023, but I think that's why often you'll see, there's a debate in DevRel world of like, should DevRel be in marketing or product or separate? There's a reason, like generally it's related toward helping people discover your products. You want to call that marketing, you want to call it something else, that's totally fine. I don't have a very strong opinion there. But I think that's usually where I think the separation is. Like DevRel is very much going to be driving awareness and or adoption, whether it be an open source or in your SaaS product. And I think that self-serve PLG type marketing is going to then take over from there.
Yeah. How does community fit into all this? Grafana's got the Slack where everybody hangs out in. There's a support forum where you can go and people respond to that. Do you and the self-serve team broadly get more engaged in those channels? Because then you can kind of start to, again, figure out that so-called hand-raising moment in the sense that they'll still sign up, as you mentioned earlier, but you can maybe figure out a bit more of that path?
I think for our stage, a lot of that's driven through other groups in open source, right? Like I think in a good way, from a focus perspective, we're able to be very focused on the SaaS product, right? Which also includes the rest of the community, right? I mean, people sitting in Slacks, joining our forums, whatever it might be. So we specifically don't spend too much time there, but spending a lot of times with those teams that do, right? And even DigitalOcean spent a ton of time on building a forum that was capturing long tail traffic and people asking each other questions and so on and so forth. I think that's part of it, right? I think that definitely feeds into the top of the funnel. I think from a monetization standpoint, that's also a thing, right? People raising their hands and look, it's just another forum for people to potentially indicate there's some level of interest. But what I'd say, and it's like not just marketing BS, like that's kind of not our intent there. Our hope is to like have it be a real community, people helping others, people working on the projects themselves, being in there and working on it. And like there's dogma, both. I think that was one of the similarities I saw across DO and Grafana is just dogma around how we thought about the community is a thing that is important. We're not here to extract as much value right away from those people and playing the long game. I think those two principles that were like led from the very, 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 very top of the business is what has been critical, right? And like not trying to destroy that as a means to try and capture an extra dollar day to day has been really important.
You've spent time now in two companies that have operated in highly competitive markets, and they've both done well, especially with, in some cases, in DigitalOcean's case, some of the largest companies ever competing against it. And even in Grafana's case, there's very large public companies. What advice do you have for folks in terms of this competitive positioning and standing out from the noise and getting developers to really understand you? It's a kind of a broad question, but I'm just purposely broad almost to just whatever comes to mind. Like, how do you kind of position in that sort of competitive environment?
The common thread between, I think, both Geo and Grafana is sort of like they kind of just like play their own game in it, right? I mean, for what it's worth, it helps that both spaces are massive markets, right? So like DigitalOcean only needed 1% of a $100 billion plus market to be an unbelievable company, right? That's easy to say in hindsight, but it turns out to be true. And then there was just a different game, right? Like at the end of the day, they were very much, the go-to-market was a key part of it. The combination of the go-to-market, right? Tutorials, how they thought about community, tied to the product, right? That's ultimately what I think PLG is, right? Like your go-to-market and your product are like deeply intertwined. Like if you ask someone about DigitalOcean, they assume the tutorials and docs and community was part of the product. They don't really think it's a separate thing, as an example. So like when people say PLG, that's ultimately what you're describing. It's like the go-to-market and the product, man, like the handshake there, the Venn diagram is deeply overlapping. So in my mind, when I think about PLG, like that's actually what people are talking about. So I think they just played their own game about how they went to market there. It was different how every other low-end hosting provider was going to market, just to be very clear. I think the story's already been written there on the big three players in the space. Like they were there to have, Slack and the next big company run their infrastructure there. It wasn't about like building the simplest experience for some dev at home at nights and weekends to host their product. So I think just playing their own game was important there. The same thing's true for Grafana. I mean, the Grafana started as and continues to be the elusive single pane of glass, right? I've actually uniquely been in the monitoring observability space even before I was at DigitalOcean. And like that is like the thing I think everyone's been saying, as far as I'm aware, in enterprise software forever, is the single pane of glass. Like turns out Grafana is probably like the best executed version of that for a bunch of reasons. One, because it was open source. I think that's like an important aspect of this. It allowed folks to continue to scale the number of data sources, whether they built them on their own or actually merge them into the core repo. That was a different approach than everybody else was taking, right? And I think Grafana's evolved to being more than just the front end, right? But having an opinionated approach toward actually doing observability across all of your metrics, logs, traces, and so on. But like those were different than how everybody else did it, right? And I think that, whether it's a small market or a major market, or I think it was like the defining characteristic. And I think both of those things you would say is product and go-to-market are very tightly aligned in how they're going about doing it. That to me is what I think is PLG, right? We can talk about like the roles and stuff, but like that is ultimately the story.
Yeah, I think that's just such a truism that we find. And frankly, a lot of times we find founders that are trying to almost force a go-to-market on top of a product that actually, in terms of the buyer, the end users, and the way it gets adopted in the org, does not map to that. And it's just like, hey, they have to go together, right? You can't just be like, hey, I'm going to go PLG, but like you're a CISO level tool, right? Like, unfortunately, there's no way to do that, right? It just doesn't work. So I think that's a really important point.
And I think the tactic there would just be different, right? Like just like the tactics for doing that, right? Like you could build like a great companion tool or like something we spent a bunch of time at DO, which was maybe even more related to the point you were making. It's like, yeah, we built a bunch, acquired or bought a bunch of tools as marketing. So it didn't mean you even had to use the product, but it was a way to show you value, even if you weren't actually using the product itself, right? It was like, oh, DigitalOcean made it really easy to get a config for Nginx, right? Which like, I don't know, it doesn't really help the business, but drives a ton of awareness as a helpful tool, right? We sort of were doing that at Grafana in our own way. So yeah, I think that like the intersection of the product and the go-to-market like actually matters. And what I found across both these companies is you're kind of there. People like myself aren't there to like, I mean, maybe this is the wrong thing to say, is to like figure out how to create these things from scratch, right? Like these were companies that had the wind at their back, that had found clear product market fit in some specific area. And like, hopefully PLG or growth is to like pour fuel on it. At worst, it's don't fuck it up, right? Like at worst, that's what it is. But sometimes that's important. But even more so, it's like, how do we just throw more gas on this thing and expand it? Get the brush fires to eventually maybe converge, something along those lines.
So last question I have for you. Out of all the startup founders that you talk to, what's the most common advice you find yourself giving over and over again when people reach out to you, whether it's self-serve specific or even generally? But what's the most common advice you find yourself giving?
I think one, it's real. Everyone's asking like, how do I hire marketing people? Or like, how do I find someone who's like my first marketing hire? Or who are the people I should bring on? And like, is it DevRel? Is it like a technical person? Is it a non-technical person? Like, I think that's the constant conversation. I think for me, if your culture of engineers or early founder is like the engineers themselves are doing the DevRel, okay, that might be good enough that you don't need necessarily to bring on a DevRel leader per se. Again, this is all super context dependent, so like the generalities are hard. Then it's like maybe okay to bring someone who's got more of a marketing bend. But the hardest part I found, because I'm one of them, to be clear, around marketing, like a lot of folks who are not engineers, don't have a technical background per se, do you understand what the hell the company does? It's like the hardest part to really figure out. Like, do you know what we are trying to do and who our audience is? Can you empathize with them at all? Is really hard because in a good way, people have been slinging enterprise software now for a long time. And like the VCs and everyone's written the right playbook on like, get a marketing ops team, write the emails, run the ads, write some content. Like, sure. What the hell are you going to say is like the hardest part to actually get right, right? Like it's actually fairly undifferentiated to do marketing ops well, or to send the emails well, or to do analytics well. Like, but are you going to even know what questions to ask of the data? Are you even going to know what are you actually going to say that is compelling? And that is all deeply, all these three things are related. And then like, the last point is like, well, yeah, the authenticity matters, right? Like at the end of the day, like people have a bullshit detector. Some are better than others. I think people assume developer technical audiences are better than others. I don't know if that's true. I think it's just that like, it's the classic story of like, if you actually know what you're talking about and you read an article and that article, is bullshit, you will know, right? I think it's like the classic story. So if you're writing about trying to monitor a Linux machine, monitor a Linux machine, you're going to know if it was written by me personally versus if it was written by someone. It's just like super obvious if that is the case. So what is my point there? I think it's the hiring for marketing is hard or product marketing in particular is because like you need to find someone who actually gets enough about what you're doing and or has the aptitude to do it. It's hard to screen for. And usually I find the best, because I think it's worked for me. So I think we only know how to look at playbooks of themselves. Like, yeah, well, I'm not the engineer, I'm not the SRE, whatever it might be, or some of the folks that we brought onto our marketing were not. But there's really high aptitude. These people can like figure it out. They're probably writing SQL, right? I know that might sound stupid, but like, does it make them an engineer? I don't know what it makes them. But like, if you can be like a junior data analyst as a marketer, you like maybe think about things a little differently. You can probably relate to what a database is. There's a couple of these things that sort of overlap with each other. So that's like one of the common thing I actually say. It's like the one quip I have of like, yeah, if like you're hiring a marketer who knows SQL, like they might have like the aptitude to actually be able to like understand what you do and probably pair them with someone like a DevRel leader, pair them with a dev who can help get them up to speed. Those are kind of three separate topics, but that like authenticity, what it means to like hire a non-technical marketer, you probably need most likely because there's hard to find technical marketers, and like DevRel, like I don't want to say DevRel specifically, but it's like someone who is the audience, who is writing the things and talking to the customers, or like the three kind of cliche, but I don't know, hopefully there's like a nugget or two that's nuanced there.
I think the biggest thing that I kind of took away actually is the hardest part, you said, is figuring out what to write and how to write that in an engaging manner. And that's the really differentiating thing, right? That still resonates in my mind of like, you can have someone set up MailChimp and instrument this and put telemetry into that and whatever, but like the content is the hard thing. ChatGPT still may help us a bit, but like can't fully get us there. So
yeah, and like I found a few of these things of like good marketing people have hired. It doesn't mean they have to write the things themselves, but it's almost like a good therapist where it's like they know the right question to ask of the right person, right? Because it's one thing to go to like a DevRel person or some engineer that you need help writing, and you're launching some product or feature. We're like, yo, hey, write me an email. That's like not actually helpful. Being able to like have like 3 bullets on what you think we might want to say, or being able to like just ask enough questions about the product to pull the right thing. Like that's usually what I've seen from good marketers in these technical worlds, like just being able to pull the right things out of the right people, right? I don't know how you screen for that, right? Just to be candid. But I think that is the nuance.
Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. Dave, thanks so much for the time. What is it that you'd like to highlight for the audience, whether for Grafana or for you personally, that people should know about?
Check out Grafana. If you aren't already familiar, you probably interacted with some capacity, or your SR teams probably do. Have them check it out. Find me on all the normal places, LinkedIn, Twitter. I don't have that much to say there, but happy to connect one way or the other.
I hope that some of these you'll externalize in a blog post, because there's certainly a lot of nuggets that I think you could start doing. And obviously you have the day job that's keeping you busy, but I think hopefully at some point those would be great stuff to externalize. And this podcast is the first step to doing that. So thanks for sharing your insights with everybody, and looking forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. This was fun.